A haunting guitar melody broke the thick silence that blanketed the house in the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles. Jake froze mid-step on the staircase, his ears drawn to the strange, unfamiliar tune. It wasn't the kind of music he usually heard, nothing cheerful or steady. Instead, it was heavy, fragmented, like a muffled cry hidden within every note. His eyes instinctively darted upstairs toward the room where the music was coming from. Emily. Just the name alone stirred something restless inside him. She had moved in yesterday, bringing with her an entirely different energy that disrupted the once predictable rhythm of the household. Jake couldn't shake the memory of her arrival, the way she had stepped out of that sleek, expensive car with an air of cool detachment. Her gaze had been sharp and unapologetic, making Jake feel invisible in his own home. She had glanced at him only once, a fleeting, almost dismissive look before walking off as though he wasn't worth a second thought, but now, the music Emily played seemed to pull him into another world. Jake began climbing the stairs cautiously, his footsteps deliberate and light, as if afraid the sound would vanish if he moved too quickly. The closer he got to Emily's room, the louder the melody grew, swelling with raw emotion. Just as he reached her door, the music abruptly stopped. In that moment, the house felt frozen, as if it were holding its breath. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to step forward or remain frozen in place. Then, her voice cut through the stillness, smooth and laced with sarcasm. Jake flinched. The door swung open, and there she was. Emily stood in the doorway, her piercing blue eyes glowing under the soft light of her bedroom. Her brown hair fell casually over her shoulders, and she wore an oversized band t-shirt that Jake didn't recognize, the kind that seemed to amplify her effortless, untamed style. But it was her gaze that truly unsettled him. Cold, sharp, and cutting, as if it could slice right through him. "I wasn't eavesdropping," Jake blurted, feeling the heat rise to his face. "It's just your guitar. It sounds nice." Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smirk that held no warmth. "Nice?" she said. "That's not exactly high praise for my music, but thanks." Jake opened his mouth, but she tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a puzzle she wasn't particularly interested in solving. "Jake, right? The quiet guy who lives here?" Jake pressed his lips together, feeling the sting of her words but choosing not to react. He wasn't great at comebacks, especially not with someone like Emily, who radiated confidence in a way that made others shrink. "Yeah, I'm Jake," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Emily crossed her arms, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Interesting. I didn't peg you as someone who'd care about music. You seem pretty closed off." Her words felt like a needle piercing his pride, but Jake managed to keep his composure. "I'm just curious. Your music, it feels emotional." For a brief moment, something softened in Emily's eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "Emotional, huh? Maybe. But emotions aren't something I like to share with just anyone." With that, she turned her back to him, stepping into her room and shutting the door before Jake could say anything else. Moments later, the sound of her guitar filled the air again. This time, the melody was more intense, stormy, almost like a tempest had been unleashed. Jake stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind buzzing with questions. Why did she seem so burdened? How could someone who exuded so much strength create music that felt so broken? He eventually retreated to his room, but the sound of Emily's guitar lingered in his mind long after he closed the door. It was like a whisper in the dark, a piece of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. And though he wouldn't admit it, Emily had awakened something in him, something he wasn't ready to name. Was it curiosity? Or perhaps something deeper, something closer to longing? What Jake didn't know was that Emily's guitar wasn't just music. It was a prelude, a quiet warning of the complex and dangerous emotions that were about to unravel, pulling both of them into a storm neither of them could escape. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Emily's guitar still echoed in his mind, as if every note had etched itself into his memory. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his chest heavy with an inexplicable restlessness. There was something about Emily that Jake couldn't quite grasp, not just the way she walked into the house with that defiant confidence, but the way her music resonated. It wasn't just heavy, it was haunting. It carried a cry for help, masked beneath each lingering chord. The next morning, Jake came down to the kitchen earlier than usual. To his surprise, Emily was already there, seated at the table with a coffee cup in front of her. She didn't say anything. She just tapped her fingers lightly on the table to an imaginary rhythm, her gaze fixed on the window. For the first time, Jake noticed something different about her. Gone was her usual air of indifference. In the soft morning light, her face betrayed a quiet sadness that he couldn't quite place. "Morning," Jake greeted, his voice breaking the silence. Emily turned to look at him, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. She replied curtly, her voice hoarse as though it carried the weight of a sleepless night. Jake slid into the seat across from her, gripping his coffee cup as if it could anchor him. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, he broke it, his tone gentle but tinged with curiosity. "Your guitar last night. It was good." Emily let out a laugh, but it wasn't one filled with joy. "Good? I don't think you really get it," she said. Jake frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily took a sip of her coffee, her gaze briefly meeting his before drifting somewhere far away. "My music. It's not for fun. It's how I escape. But no matter how much I play, reality's always there, waiting for me." Jake didn't know how to respond. He felt the weight of her words, the raw honesty behind them. There was something simmering beneath her surface, something trapped, something she couldn't free herself from. But before he could ask more, Emily set her coffee cup down and leaned back in her chair. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" she asked, her voice low yet sharp, like a blade cutting through his thoughts. Jake froze. The question struck deep, pulling at things he'd never shared with anyone. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "All the time." Emily smirked, but it wasn't mocking. It was tired, as though she had long been resigned to a truth they both understood. "Well, at least we have that in common." She stood, taking her empty coffee cup to the sink. Jake watched her, her confidence masking a loneliness he could feel but not fully comprehend. For a moment he hesitated, unsure if he should say something, but he couldn't stop himself. "Why do you feel that way?" he asked. Emily froze mid-motion, her hand clutching the cup. She didn't turn to face him, but her voice cut through the air, cold and bitter. "Because this place, this house, this life, it's all an arrangement. My mom didn't marry your dad for love. She married him because she needed stability. Someone who could carry the weight she couldn't. And me? I'm just the baggage she brought along." Jake felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected her to be so blunt, to strip away the polite facade of their blended family with such brutal honesty. Her words shattered the carefully constructed image of harmony his father had tried so hard to create. Emily turned back to him, and for the first time, her sharp gaze softened into something hollow, something vulnerable. "Do you ever feel like you're just a piece in someone else's game?" she asked. Her voice quieter now. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily nodded slightly, as if she already understood, then walked out of the kitchen, leaving Jake alone with a storm of emotions raging inside him. After she left, Jake stared out the window, where the morning sunlight spilled over the backyard. In his chest, a question lingered. Who was Emily, really? And why did he feel such an irresistible pull to understand her, as though discovering her truth was something he couldn't avoid? Jake didn't realize it then, but this was only the beginning of a connection neither of them could have foreseen. That afternoon, the house was eerily empty. Jake sat on the sofa in the living room, his eyes fixed on the TV, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His dad and stepmother had gone out for dinner, leaving the house to just him and Emily. Jake was used to evenings like this. His dad was always busy, and his stepmother rarely stayed still, but Emily's presence made everything feel different. It was charged, filled with an inexplicable tension that Jake couldn't quite place. He heard her footsteps descending the stairs, slow and deliberate, as if she were carefully weighing each step. Jake didn't turn around, but he could feel her enter the living room. When she sat down in the chair opposite him, he couldn't help but glance her way. Her brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, her legs crossed, and in her hand was a glass of red wine. Emily looked as though she belonged to a world far removed from his, distant, untouchable. "Do you always watch TV like this? Looks mind-numbingly boring?" she said, her tone teasing, yet carrying an undertone of something Jake couldn't quite identify. Jake shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Just killing time." Emily smirked, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She took a sip of her wine, her gaze flicking to the TV before settling on Jake. "Killing time? How fascinating. Don't you have anything better to do?" Jake felt the edge in her words, but instead of reacting, he stayed silent. "I've kept the emotional weight and tension while refining the pacing and dialogue. The focus is on making the exchange feel natural, but impactful. Let me know if you'd like to adjust anything further." He didn't want to admit how unsettled he'd been since Emily arrived, but his silence seemed to amuse her, spurring her on. "Are you always like this?" she asked, tilting her head, her eyes narrowing as if studying him. "Always hiding from everything?" Jake frowned, turning to face her. "And you? Are you always trying to provoke people?" Emily laughed, this time more genuine. She set her glass of wine on the coffee table, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "Maybe, but at least I'm not pretending otherwise." The two of them fell into silence. Not a comfortable one, but one thick with tension, like a string pulled taut and ready to snap. Jake tried to focus on the TV, but Emily's gaze burned into him, consuming everything in its path. He couldn't take it anymore. "What do you really want?" Jake asked, his voice low but steady. Emily leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "I don't want anything. I'm just curious about you." "Me?" Jake scoffed lightly. "What could possibly be interesting about me?" Emily didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her gaze peeling back the layers he'd spent years building to protect himself. "Maybe it's because you keep hiding. You make me want to figure out who you really are." Jake felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to anyone looking at him like that, so directly, so intensely. He didn't know how to respond. But before he could try, Emily stood up, grabbing her wine glass. "Don't worry," she said, her voice soft yet tinged with challenge. "I'm not expecting you to answer." She walked out of the living room, leaving Jake sitting there, overwhelmed and confused. He didn't know what to do, but a part of him couldn't let her walk away like that. Almost instinctively, he stood and followed her out to the backyard. She was standing under the dim glow of the patio light, her wine glass in hand, her gaze fixed on the dark sky. Jake stopped a few feet away, not daring to move closer but unwilling to retreat. "Why did you follow me out here?" she asked, her voice quieter this time, carrying a softness that caught him off guard. Jake hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know." Emily turned to face him, her blue eyes shimmering in the faint light. "You don't know? That's strange. I thought you always knew what you wanted." Jake let out a small, dry laugh. And you do. You always know what you want. Emily stepped closer, and Jake could feel her presence, strong, almost overpowering, like it wrapped around him, leaving him unable to move. Maybe I do. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure it out. Jake didn't respond. They stood there, their eyes locked in a moment that felt impossibly significant. He didn't know who leaned in first, but before he realized it, Emily was so close that he could feel her breath against his skin. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Have you ever thought that some things, even if they're wrong, are still worth trying? Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. Before he could even process what was happening, Emily leaned in, her lips brushing against his. It was a kiss so light, so fleeting, yet it ignited something deep inside him, something he couldn't deny. It wasn't a long kiss, but it was enough to change everything. When Emily pulled back, her eyes glistened with an emotion Jake couldn't place. Sadness, perhaps, or something far more complicated. We both know this is a mistake, she said softly, her gaze never leaving his. But who cares? She turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there with his heart pounding and his thoughts in chaos. He knew, without a doubt, that this moment would haunt him forever. Whether he liked it or not, this was only the beginning. Jake knew something had shifted since that moment in the garden when Emily kissed him. Everything felt like it had been turned upside down. Every time their eyes met, the air seemed to freeze, and the memory of that kiss hung over them like a heavy, unspoken secret, saturating the very walls of the house. But the tension wasn't confined to just Jake and Emily. Ryan, Jake's best friend, had begun to notice something was off. Ryan was a straightforward guy, and over the past few weeks he couldn't ignore Jake's strange behavior. Jake, already reserved by nature, now seemed to go out of his way to avoid Ryan's gaze whenever Emily entered the room. And Emily? She remained her usual self, confident, nonchalant. But Ryan began to notice the subtle way she glanced at Jake when she thought no one was looking. The answers came on a Friday night. Jake, Ryan, Emily, and a few friends had gathered at a bar near campus to unwind after a long week. The place buzzed with life, laughter, and music, blending into a lively hum. But Jake couldn't focus. He felt suffocated by Emily's presence at the far end of the table. She wore a simple black dress that, despite its simplicity, made her look effortlessly captivating. Every time she laughed, Jake couldn't stop himself from stealing a glance, even though he knew those stolen looks could lead to trouble. Ryan, sitting next to Jake, seemed to pick up on it. When Emily got up to grab another drink, Ryan leaned toward Jake, his voice dropping. "What's going on with you and her?" he asked, half joking, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Jake shrugged, trying to deflect. "Nothing. She's just hard to figure out." Ryan frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You know, I used to think I liked her," he said, his voice quieter. "But now, I'm not so sure. She's different, don't you think?" Jake didn't reply, and his silence only confirmed what Ryan was starting to suspect. A few hours later, as the group began to break apart and head home, Ryan decided to act. When Jake stood up to leave, Ryan followed him at a distance. He watched as Jake slipped outside into the alley behind the bar. What he didn't expect was that Emily appeared moments later. Ryan froze, his heart pounding. He stepped closer, careful to stay hidden in the shadows, but close enough to see. And then he saw it. In the dim glow of the streetlights, Emily and Jake stood facing each other. Ryan couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Emily stepped closer, saw the way Jake didn't pull back. Then, unmistakably, Emily leaned in and kissed him. Not a fleeting, innocent kiss, but something real, charged with emotion. shattering every line they weren't supposed to cross. Ryan couldn't believe what he was seeing. He turned away abruptly, his chest heaving. His best friend, Jake, the person he trusted the most, had not only betrayed his family, but also taken away the girl Ryan had quietly hoped to have a chance with. Ryan didn't know what to do with the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The next day, Ryan confronted Jake. They stood in the empty basketball court after class, away from prying eyes. Ryan crossed his arms, his expression heavy with anger and disappointment. Jake didn't need any words to know what this was about. He could see it in Ryan's face. "You think I didn't see?" Ryan said, his voice simmering with barely restrained fury. "I saw you with Emily last night." Jake froze. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What the hell are you thinking?" Ryan continued, his voice rising. "She's your stepsister. She's family. And you kissed her. How could you do this?" Jake felt cornered. "It's not as simple as you think," Jake said, his voice weak. "Not simple?" Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Then explain it to me. How does something like this happen? Did you even think about your dad? About your family? You think I don't know all of that?" Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he lost control for the first time. "I know, Ryan. I know this is wrong. I know how bad it is, but I can't stop. I can't stop." Ryan stood silent for a moment, his anger slowly giving way to something deeper. Disappointment. "Jake," he said quietly, his voice strained. "This isn't just about you and Emily. This is going to destroy your family. And if you don't stop, I can't promise to keep this to myself." Jake stood there, watching as Ryan turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his words. Jake knew Ryan was right, but the one thing he didn't know was how to let Emily go. When every time he saw her, he felt like he couldn't breathe without her. The house had never felt so cold. The walls, once alive with the warmth of everyday family conversations, now echoed only with the ticking of the clock and a silence that felt oppressive. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The confrontation with Ryan from the day before replayed endlessly in his mind, like a broken record stuck on its most painful refrain. He knew everything was spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion, but what would that conclusion be? Emily, the one person who made him feel truly alive, was also the one pulling him into a vortex of torment. Ryan, his best friend, now looked at him with disappointment and betrayal. And, above all, there was his father, the man who had always expected Jake to be good, to do what was right. It was as if the weight of everyone's expectations and the mess he had created was crushing him, leaving him unable to breathe. A soft knock broke the stillness. Jake looked up and his heart stopped when he saw Emily standing in the doorway. She wore a loose sweater and jeans, her simple attire only amplifying the beauty that made it impossible for him to look away. For the first time, her piercing blue eyes lacked their usual sharpness or defiance. Instead, they held a sadness so deep it felt like it could swallow him whole. "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake nodded, and Emily stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She sat beside him on the bed, her hands clasped together as if trying to steady herself. A long silence stretched between them, heavy and full of unspoken truths. Finally, Emily broke it. "I know things are slipping out of control," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "And I know we can't keep doing this." Jake felt a sharp pain in his chest. "Emily, I don't want to lose you." Emily turned to him, her eyes shimmering as if on the verge of tears. "Do you think I want that?" she whispered. "Do you think I want to let go of the only thing that's made me feel like I'm not alone?" Jake took her hands in his eyes pleading. "Then don't," he said softly. "We can find a way. We'll figure something out. We'll keep it all. Keep you. Keep the family. Emily shook her head softly, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. Jake, this isn't just about us. It's about your dad, my mom, everything this family is built on. If they find out, do you really think they'll ever see us the same way again? Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. He already knew the answer, and admitting it felt like stabbing himself in the heart. Emily gently pulled her hands free from his, standing and moving toward the window. She stared out into the black sky, where faint stars flickered like dying embers. I've thought about this. So much, Emily said, her voice breaking. I've thought about all the ways we could make this work, but the more I think about it, the more I realize we can't. At least, not now. Jake stood and walked over to her, close enough to feel her presence but not daring to touch her. Emily, if you leave, I won't survive. I can't live without you. Emily turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. You can, Jake. You're stronger than you think. And one day, when all of this isn't so heavy, when we're not a burden to each other anymore, maybe then we'll find each other again. Jake shook his head, his voice breaking. I don't want to wait. I want you now. Here. With me. Emily smiled a sad but tender smile, reaching up to gently place her hand on his cheek. Her touch was warm, comforting, but it felt like a goodbye. Jake, sometimes loving someone means letting them go. Not because you want to, but because it's the only way to keep both of you from falling apart. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with desperation, but he said nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right. The next day, Emily left. Her mother was told that she wanted to return to New York to continue her studies to find her own path. No one in the family said much more about it, but Jake knew the truth. This was Emily's way of protecting them both from complete ruin. He stood at his bedroom window, watching as the car pulled out of the driveway. Emily didn't look back. Jake didn't wave. Yet, he felt something inside him break, something vital slipping away, something he wasn't sure he could ever recover. Weeks turned into months. Life gradually resumed its usual rhythm, or at least, it pretended to. But every time Jake passed the balcony where he had first heard Emily's guitar, he paused for a moment, as if waiting for something to return. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe, one day, when things were easier, they would find their way back to each other. But for now, Jake could only do the one thing he knew how to do: keep moving forward. Even though every step carried the weight of someone he could never forget. And somewhere, Jake knew that Emily, wherever she was, carried a piece of him with her, forever.